So today for our objects review, we're going to go back to sort of what we learned in week 1. And I'm going to answer any questions that you have regarding objects just in general. For now, I have basic template built out for a couple models. I don't know. Oh, wait, yeah. And then I added kind of like a join class for now that's empty. So we can really take a look at these objects that we have and think about how do we actually connect them and make them communicate or represent that relationship with each other based on what our domain is. And then go over some tactical things. We'll build out some methods to get some stats that will kind of force you to look at how those objects are going to communicate with each other. So this is mainly review. And I know coming out of the code challenge, there might be a lot of questions just in general about Ruby and what we've done so far. So I have kind of like an empty section for now. And this is your chance to ask any and all questions that have been hazy so far. Moving into SQL, it can be hard to understand the relational stuff that's happening on the database side if the foundation of how it's represented in Ruby is still a little hazy. So this is also another chance for you to clear up questions on that too. So anything you want to add to the list right off the bat when we're talking about relationships, debugging, pry, Ruby?
Kind of in depth about pry, like I would put it in something and it just completely skips right over it.
How to use, I'll say like call, debug with pry.
My question would be to gain a better understanding of how you can test your own code without having, like RSpec or anything there.
Without RSpec, yeah.
Well, I'll let you finish typing. So when we have everything built in the joiner table or the joiner add all, a more svelte, more sophisticated, easier way to loop through it all without having to stick them all into a variable, and better understanding of how do you chain that data as well. Like when you use person.1, person1 dot whatever versus the class dot whatever, and that syntax.
So more also like instance methods versus class methods.
And the syntax in particular for me.
Okay.
When to use them makes sense, just that.
And then I would also like to add, is it preferable to use enumerables over if else and while statements and while loops?
Preferable to use enumerables versus looping while if else. What else? These are great. I love it.
How to pull a particular set of data from the array or add it all.
Yeah.
What if I just want one thing? What if I don't want the first and last name? I just want the first name.
What if I just want one thing? So, oh, like attribute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
For some reason.
Oh no, that's totally fine. Trying to like write it down, like first name, last name. Like, don't talk about the code challenge, but we are. All right. I think I heard something else.
Yeah, it was just on that, like the right block syntax when you're enumerabling through the join class to get data from the other has many. Just yeah.
Wait, block syntax?
Yeah, like when you're using the enumerables, which like the right syntax when you're going down through the array through the join class, just getting just another demonstration on that.
So getting comfortable with what enumerables to use, what goes in between the blocks?
Yes.
Okay.
Mainly what goes in between the blocks, because I kind of get the enumerables just like going between the blocks as well.
Yeah, that's related to kind of my question as well.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, it's kind of like on Brad's.
Yeah.
Right. Cool.
Bring the syntax down.
What else? Awesome. Not hearing any further questions, so let us move onwards. I'll try to answer as many of these I can in the moment. I think the only one that I can answer right away off of the top of the head is this one, just like a true or false question. Which one is preferable? I would say for our world right now, it is preferable in Mod 1 that you get comfortable using enumerables and you know which ones to use, what to select when you're processing the add-all arrays. So it's more preferable to use enumerables right now. Once you start, like once you've graduated and you're going through the interview process and you're looking at just general data, like data structure questions, it is not preferable to use enumerables because people want to see how good you are solving problems without using tools that are Ruby specific. So I wasn't sure like what the context of this question was, but I will say for now, in Mod 1, especially when you're doing code challenges and when you're doing projects, use enumerables. They take care of a lot of the work for us so that we don't have to do the work. So it's going to be beneficial. And I forgot who asked this question, but if you want to elaborate or ask more, feel free to. I'll say for now.
I did. I think you answered it just fine for me.
Awesome.
You know, because as I'm going through the questions, I'm like, well, instinctively, I just want to do while loops and things like that.
Yeah, and this will become more important later. But yeah, for now, check out enumerables and get comfortable with the documentation so that you're using them right now. Cool. And for the rest of these, I'm going to start building out a class while also explaining my thought process, and hopefully that kind of answers these questions. And if I miss any of these questions, or if you have any questions based off of that, the code that we're going to build out, feel free to speak up and we can go over that. So I'll try to hit as many of these as I can, and I'll do a check. And if I miss any, feel free to shout them out and ask those questions in play. Cool. So regarding objects review, the one thing that I wanted to go over, I think there was a question in the Google Docs also, in terms of when we're representing relationships, how do we know those objects are connected? Right now, I have kind of like a student class that I've set up the basic template for. And I've done the same for the mod class. So the relationship that we're defining is there are some students and there are some mods. If we're looking at the current case right now, there's 5 mods, and you're going to go through each mod and attend every single mod at least once at some point in this program. So that's where attendance comes in, which is empty right now. In the world of classes, student and mod are not connected yet. They're instances that exist outside of that because you can have mods exist on their own, and you can have students exist on their own without really doing anything.
Quick question. Will this also be uploaded somewhere else as well?
This will be in the class lecture code.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll upload the lecture code right after, and I'll also, I think I'm recording, so I'll upload the video too. Yeah. Are there any questions on what the basic setup of this is? I just made them all adder accessor, which gives us access to read or write the data. And we have our add-all set up already so that we can store all of the instances of a student as they get created.
So real quick, just to clarify with the self, every time we create a new student, since self is being shoveled into the add-all, self referring to the new student, it's going into the array.
Yep, exactly. And let me kind of show you, I'm gonna open up my terminal and we can walk through it. And this kind of goes in line with, is this where we are? Yeah, this kind of goes in line with, if I have a binding.pry in my code, how am I going to invoke that method and how am I going to call that pry? So when we're working with binding.pry, and when we insert this piece of code on line 9, what you want to think about is I still have my template that's available to me. And in my template, I say when a student is created, when I see that pry, Ruby's going to go through line by line by line. It's going to create that student. And when it initializes a student, it will only stop that program during runtime when your instance is being initialized and when it calls this pry. Just because you have a pry inside of the code here does not mean that your pry is going to be hit because it hasn't been initialized yet. So right now, if I say Ruby tools, is it in tools? Nope, it's just in console. So if I say Ruby console.rb, 11 object study hall require relative. Let's read this error. What is this saying? Cannot load such file. Let me clear this and run this again. Cannot load such file. Oh, I renamed. So in this case, I renamed current to attendance because before it was current. And you're getting this error where it says cannot load such file for require relative on line 4. So let's go ahead and check it out. So let's go to console, line 4. Before it was named current and I renamed it attendance. So I'm going to change this real quick. All right. Since this is ad hoc, we'll hit a lot of debugging errors, but that's all right. Cool. So right now I ran Ruby console.rb. And what's happening in console so far is I require pry, so I can use it within my project. I have all of the required relative for mod, attendance, and student. So it's taken the template that we've written, attendance is empty, but it's taken the template that we've written in mod and student, and it is now available inside of my console. That is why I can say mod, and it's able to recognize it. I don't get that uninitialized constant error. I can say student, and I get student, no error. However, if I say attendance, it's gonna yell at me, whether it's capital or not, it's gonna yell at me and say, hey, where is attendance coming from? Because we haven't defined it yet. So anytime you see this uninitialized constant, it's gonna say it's not able to recognize that class. And for now, we know that inside of our student class, my binding.pry is currently in the initialize. In order to get to the initialize inside of the student class, I need to call that method. And initialize is a little special because the method that calls the initialize method is the .new. So I can say student.new. I can be a student for now. Say Sedaria. I've been in all the mods, so I can be like, this is my mod. Oh, oops. So I can say student.new, and we're gonna get given one, expected 2, which means that it needs 2 arguments, which I forgot, so I'm gonna say Seattle. All right, so now I've hit my pry. It called the initialize method that was available for our template or source code, and it was able to see that pry on line number 10 and stop my code. So my code has been paused during runtime at this moment, and I have access to everything that's within the scope. When I say scope, I just mean this method here. So I have access to name, location, the instance variable name, and the instance variable location. I have access to add at all, and I have access to self.
So you have access to the scope, not the what's above binding pry.
Yep. I only have access to, well, wait, I do have access to this. Is that what you mean? What do you
Yeah,
mean by
you have access to that, and you have access to add at all below the binding pry.
Oh, no, you're right. I technically still have access to add at all because it's a class variable within this, but this line has not been run yet. So nothing's been added to add at all.
So if it was a at store on that line 10, you would not have access to it.
That is correct. Binding.pry pauses my code. Any other questions? Cool. So typically when you're debugging, what you're going to end up doing is putting binding.pry in the method, and then you need to call that method. And this will continuously change based on what class you're in, whether it's an instance method or a class method. And I guess like those are the main 2 things you need to be thinking about. Is it the student class? And if it is the student class, do I need to say student dot, or do I need to say the instance I'm looking at dot? And based on whether it's a class method or an instance method, you have access to different variables. self is the most powerful one because in an instance method, self is going to represent that whole object that you just created. So when I type in self here, I have access to this whole thing. And to go off of how do I access the attributes from here, let me clear this out. So I'm looking at self and it's the whole object. And if I want to get to location and name, I have to access the reader and writer that's been set to give me whether to update or read it. If I just want to read it, then I need to reference this adder accessor here. Inside of student, I've defined this macro that writes out my readers and writers for me. And that's what's going to allow me to say self.location and self.name. Without these two, I would not be able to do this. And the reason that I'm able to say self dot is because this is an instance of a student. Now, like, pause there for questions.
When would you use like self.location versus students1.location?
Right now,
You initialize new as Sundaria, and we're going to store your instance in a variable student1.
Yep. When you want to use the other is going to vary depending on where you are in your program. So right now, inside of my student class, I don't have access to that variable. I only have access to self. So the only way that I can get to location and name for that student is by saying self.location. If you have access to the variable and it has the whole object in there, then you can say like Sundaria.name or variable.name and it'll return the name. But since I'm inside of the instance, I'm inside of the initialize, I don't have access to Sundaria. Whether it's in my console or not, the scope has changed. Cool. Any other questions? All right, so I know that was like one question, which ended up being like a long answer. But that's what the self is doing here. Because I have access to this whole instance, what I'm saying is take Sundaria and let's go ahead and put that in add at all so I can trace through it. So now if I run this line here, so we'll have duplicates, but it's all right. If I run this line here, this is add at all, and now it has Sundaria inside it. And that's the general structure that we're going to have for all of our classes. Let me create a variable. Now in my pry, I created it while I was inside of the pry, but it'll probably be more useful to have those instances here so that we can pass them in. So I'll say student.new. I'll make Ahmed a student too. Although he was a student before. So I'll say Ahmed, he's in Denver. Anyone want to volunteer for a student? A couple people. Ashley, Brad, sure. Cool.
What is that keyboard shortcut, the copy of the line?
It is Option Shift down. Let me delete. Did I hear one more person? I don't remember. All right. Cool. I got some instances. This is how you create it. And this is matching up 1-to-1 with name and location, just like we defined in our student. Mod has a description, but I'll create some mods real quick so we can work with it. I'll do one is mod.new. The string is 1. I'll say Ruby 2. It's mod 2. Ruby on Rails 3 is mod 3, which is JavaScript. And 4 is 4, which is React. All right, So we got some mods, we got some students. Now we can try to make some students take a class, which is going to be the attendance for us.
Want to change variables?
Which variable? Oh, thank you. Brad. All right, and I think there also was a question of how do I test classes that I'm writing and classes that I create? Immediately off the bat, I have some classes that I've written some code for. If I want to make sure it works, for now, initialize is called with the .new, and this also takes care of the add-all and inserting the add-all. So by saying .new here, I'm immediately validating if my add-all is going to work and if my initialize is going to work. So make sure that you write code as you test. I know sometimes if you're spending a lot of time writing these out in the beginning, you also lose time that you could have been coding or starting to write the solution code for the classes. So balance your time there. Don't spend too much time in the beginning writing this up. So let me do Ruby console.rb. And typically, if I made an error, it's going to show up right away when I try to run console. So this is another great way to take care of syntax errors or take care of any other errors that may show up. For now, I'm getting this. Oh yeah, go ahead.
How much of the code would you try doing before you started writing all those out? Just getting pretty much your like basic ones down?
Yeah, I would say a couple if you really want to write some before. Typically, especially like sometimes you're going to have code presented to you. So if you want to make sure the code that's given to you works, then you can write a couple down. But you shouldn't be writing like all of the method test cases right at the beginning. So that's when you need to go back and forth.
I guess a clarifying question I would have then, because of what you just said, is wanting to know like proper dot syntax.
Proper doc syntax?
Yeah, like using like dot new and dot whatever.
Yeah, in this case, whenever we're trying to create it, do you mean like, in this case, why we're saying dot new, like student dot new?
No, like if you did, for example, like student dot all dot something else.
Yeah, like for me, it's like in the pry. What are the dot commands in the pry?
Dot commands in the pry. Okay, let me start putting a pry somewhere, and then we can debug it. Let me fix my syntax error here. So I will. This is in mod. I made a typo somewhere. Oh, I forgot to declare add-all. Cool. And I will create a new method. Let's create a method. Oh, we still need to create our join first. So we'll add in the join real quick. But let me put a binding. You write an instance method. Because I want to target.
Can we create a method that just pulls the description of each person?
Sure. So we'll say description. Yeah, I'll just work with like some instance method, and I'll put a binding dot right here. So I'm running my console. I have some instances that have been created, and let's get into this description method so we can kind of experiment and do some stuff. So if I want to call description from my console, I'm going to pick one of the mods, and mod is, or description is an instance method. Right now I'm overriding the getter for it, but we'll deal with that. We'll rename that later. But it's an instance method, so I need to call it off a mod instance. And all I need to say is one.description. If I click enter, I'm now in my pry. And is your question what options are available to me if I want to go into self.all from there?
Yes.
All right, so I'm in my instance, and if I take a look at my mod class, I have this add-all variable, and there's a bunch of different ways you can call this add-all. I would say, well, since you're in the instance itself, you're going to say add-all, and add-all is going to return all of the mods. Something I do want to point out if you're trying to do self here, self is that instance. So you don't have access to the getter from the class level. So typically, if you're trying to say self.all when you're inside of an instance method, it's going to bug out. And that's because the context of self has changed. But since you're within the class, you have access to the add@all variable, and you can use that back and forth. And I know students also say mod.all in order to get the getter for that. That will also work. So like mod.all will do the same thing. Pause there for questions. All right, now.
Was the one dot description correct?
Yes, self is the one dot description right here. So self is, if I did it right, yeah, self is Ruby 1. Cool. And then I think for this one, I could have made this a class method, because let's say we want to get all of the descriptions. So let's say we just want to get all the descriptions that this class does. I have access to add@all. And whenever we're trying to use enumerables or use methods, you want to really pay attention to what the data type is so that you know where to go from there. Anytime you see an array or a collection of items within your program, then that's a good indication that you can use some kind of enumerable to get what we want. And for this one, our deliverable or what our goal is to get all the description. So I just want an array that is all of the description for our mods. And you can use tons of enumerables out there to get this specific data. For us, if I ever want to get new information that's going to be just a specific variable, so I'm changing the structure of this mod so that it's just a description rather than the whole thing, that's going to be a great place to use map or collect. I think those are the only aliases for that. You can technically use reduce also to get that data. So yeah, let's go ahead and try writing it out. So this is a case where we're going to say add@all. And typically with the enumerable, we're going to say dot enumerable. So I'm going to say map, and I'll write the whole thing out. In between these pipes, by convention, it should be the object that you're looking at. So I'm going to say mod. And what I actually want to return is the description. So I'm going to say mod dot description. Description. And so this is what will end up being the this is what will end up being inside of the block for this specific enumerable. Now I'm going to copy this over, and I'm going to put a pry in between the loop so that we can see specifically what that ends up being. If there's any questions on what we did, feel free to ask.
Would you need to put a self in front of all descriptions? Self dot all descriptions?
Self
Since it's a
dot,
class.
oh yes, I would.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Just making sure.
Yeah, let's make it a class method. That's the.
I have
way
a
to do it.
question.
Yeah.
Is it better to use add@all versus just using mod.all that map?
I would say technically it's probably better to say mod.all because you're protected by the
Okay,
reader,
cool.
whereas add@all you're
Yeah.
getting access directly.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a good
Okay.
question. The cool part is now that this is a class method, before I had to call it off of 1 because we made it an instance method. But realistically, it makes more sense to make this a class method because we're looking at all of the mods. And in order to call that, I will say mod dot all descriptions. So it's the same method, or same method, different signature, and signature is just this right here. So I'm going to say mod dot all descriptions. Oh, dang it, I forgot to put the pry. But we get an array of all of the descriptions. Let me rerun that. The important thing that we need to pay attention to when we're trying to figure out what goes in between the block is this variable right here. This variable is going to determine what you need to write here so that you can get the value that we want. So our add@all is going to be just a collection of a bunch of mod objects. Cool. And right now, enumerable is going to go line by or object by object, one by one through all of them. And currently, our mod object that we're looking at, what's in between the pipes, is the first one, which is Ruby. So this gives me an indication of thinking about how can I get from this mod object to grabbing just the description. And that's where this getter comes in, and we can say, oh, if I need to get the description of this, I'm going to say mod.description. And it gives me Ruby. So you can directly see what's in between, what object or current instance you're looking at, and what you want returned. If I wanted the name, I would put in mod.name. So that will drive what's in between the blocks. Any questions on that?
As rule of thumb, whatever you're iterating through, the block is going to be the singular of what the whole thing is, what the whole array is of, pretty much.
Yep, exactly. So if it's just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then it's going to represent each number. So I typically call this number in between the pipes. If we're looking at the add it all for a student, then it's going to be each student object. So that's why for the enumerable, what goes here is entirely reliant on the current instance we're looking at and the array that we're going through.
Okay. So if it was students, it would just be the student would go in the block.
Yes, let me exit.
Gotcha.
Yeah, if it's students, the student will go in between.
Cool.
So if we are pulling information from the class variable, should we always make a class method?
Yes. Well,
Gotcha.
no, never mind. I take that back. Because you can have an instance method look at another class method from a different class. So whether it's a class method or an instance method, it is depending on if you're looking at
The class itself? Or
the class itself.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So we would use a class method when using add at all if we're looking at something within that class. If we're looking at a different class, then we don't have to.
Exactly. Because I can write a method called, like, let's say students, and this can talk to student.all. But it's still an instance method because this students is from the instance of that mod.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Cool.
In terms of this binding pry here,
Oh, oops, yes.
if you were to have it on, if you were to move it down so it is on the new line 21, you no longer in your binding pry. Yeah.
That is true.
You no longer have access to your mod.description.
Yep.
And that was a frustrating point this morning until I remembered that. Because I'm like, why can't I access this? And I'm like, oh, well, my binding pry is not in the right scope.
Yep. Yeah, binding.pry, just like you said, scoping matters a lot because it changes during the runtime of your program is constantly changing second by second by second. So you really need to pay attention to where you're putting that stopping point to debug.
Would a rule of thumb be if you don't have it in an end statement, you don't have access to that? Like 17, 18, 19 is outside the scope of binding pry right now. So you might get all.map, but you're not going to get inside of that end.
Yeah, I think that could be a general rule, like pay attention to the ends because the end is determining what the scope of that method or class is. So I would say that's a pretty good indication to figure out where your binding pry is. Yeah, if it's in the class, you can technically put a binding.pry anywhere you want. Like we have in our console, there's no end, but we still have a binding.pry. So I would say like most of the time, yeah, but there will be cases because this can go anywhere. All right, any other questions so far? And if there's new questions that come up, I can add to the list, of course.
I have a question. So when we're re-entering the console, and then do we have to exit through it every time until we get to where our classes are initialized before we can start testing?
What do you mean by exit through it?
Like, because sometimes it'll take you through different classes first with like binding.pries. And then once you get to that binding pry on 17, then you're able to basically do all the other classes because they weren't initialized yet.
Yes.
So
yeah,
then,
so you'll...
okay, so then are there quicker ways to do that?
I would say for now, there isn't.
Okay.
Because when we're putting binding.pries and we're debugging our code, it's entirely reliant on what we've written so far. And that's going to change case by case. So sometimes
Okay.
you will have to, like even right now, like if I have a couple pries, I will have to exit and kind of like exit
Gotcha.
a couple times.
Okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes you put the binding pry at the end of the code, right?
Yes.
So
For our, let's see. So for our purpose here, at least for now, we are not going to have a binding.pry at the end of student, mod, or attendance because we are communicating, these have a relationship with each other. And the only place that we have access to all three of them is inside of my console. That's why my binding pry is at the end here.
Okay.
My code for attendance, or not attendance, but let's say for student, I put a binding.pry at the end here, which means I always forget. I'm going to require pry at the top. And before we were able to say, well, right now we can't say mod, but let's say I want to talk to mod. It should never happen when you have a join, but I'll put it here. Let's say I want to talk to mod. And if I exit and I try to run Ruby models, nope. Oh wait, they're all in the same place. So I'm in student.rb. I loaded up my code. I'm loaded up the class. I'm in my binding.pry, and let's try student.all. So I'm, oh wait, where's my pry? Did I have a pry? Oh, I have my mod. So my mod.all is in self.all. So I'm saying student.all. And when I click enter, I hit this error because it's not able to recognize mod, because nowhere in here have I required mod. So it doesn't know what that code is. So that's why we have our binding.pry at the in console, because this is the single place within our whole project where it's required all three of them.
So if I have different classes, I shouldn't use with binding pry at the end of each page.
Yes, your binding pry should be in console,
Yeah.
and you're calling those methods from here. So right now, when we called, in a sense, we were in mod, when we called all descriptions, we said mod.all descriptions. When we call students, we say mod1 or 1.students. So that's why it becomes super important to pay attention to what kind of method you're calling, and whether it's a class method, instance method, and what class it is.
Okay.
But if you want to test out your instance methods within, say, class mod, since we're looking at it, could you put the binding pry on line 27, call it from council.rb, and then you would then be able to say, whatever you called that with, student one, and then you could call your functions without having to kind of go back and forth.
Yes, if you are calling it from the console, you will be able to do that because you have access to all of the code. That is true. Any other questions?
I think, Noah, that's what you were doing.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Oh, so if you put a binding.pry here.
Yeah, correct.
If I put it, even if I put it in the end, but I still call it through the console.
So put it in the end. Put it in the end here. Yeah, I think if you have a require pry, it should still work. That is true. So you'll still need to say require pry. If you put it at the end here, you won't entirely have access to the source. Let me try it. Let me see what happens.
You won't have access because the classes aren't initialized, I think, right?
I'll see what happens because my initial answer is no, but we'll see. Cool. So
Yeah.
You can still hit the pry outside the class. So I ran console.rb. I hit the pry, and technically, since I have access to everything within my console, I have access to mod. That's correct.
But I don't have anything inside because I have all the data in the console.
Yes. So when you think about the order of when this is happening, this load of this pry is being hit from this line right here. It's not being hit down here. Yep. So none of this has been created yet. So we're not able to see all the instance.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So even though you're hitting the pry, it's before this stuff. Yeah, that's a good question. True.
So is that why it would be preferable to run it in console?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Console is easier because you can define the instances here, and then you have access to all of it. You can technically require relative, all the other stuff here, and do it at the end. I think for debugging, it's easier if you have all of the stuff in one place. Let me exit out of this. All right, any other questions? Things you want to try?
Can we loop through a joined set of data?
Yeah, let's do it.
There's confusion for me for how you chain things and trying to make.
Yeah. So let's create some joins. Right now we got some students, we got some mods, and joining them together is what this attendance is for. So I have this second class here, and I'm gonna fill in attendance. And attendance is our join class. So attendance belongs to initialize. Oh, I've been staring at code for a long time. Like words aren't making sense. Because attendance is the join, it belongs to both the student and the mod. So it's going to take in a student instance, and it's going to take in a mod instance. And let's also put a date. I'll just make it a string for now. So I'll say at student equals student, at mod equals mod, and at date equals date. It's only through these two variables that this attendance connects the object instances together. So without this, there is no connection between the two. Very important that this is the whole instance itself also. So I'm gonna put the rest of the boilerplate in. Adder accessor. I'll just make them accessor for now. Reader will technically also work. And then I'll make the add at all. And I'm going to say def self.all add it all. So typically, if I randomly want to create some joins, actually just to save some time, I'm going to take this out. All right, it's just the join. It has those two things. That's it.
Hello. Yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you. What? Ooh, this is when I know my keyboard is. There's a delay. No keyboard. All right, so self into add it all. That is correct. And in my console, I'm just gonna pick some random mods. So I'm gonna say attendance dot.new, and I'm gonna go into mod, and I'll say sample. Let me check the order real quick. Student mod. So student needs to come first. All right. You all are going to be in all of the mods randomly, but that's okay, just for some test case purposes. And I'm going to do that a bunch of times. So this will also account for the case that there could be some repeats. Why not? All right, so now if I say ruby console.rb, if everything is set up right, oh, I still have my pry in here. Wait, student.rb. I'll comment this out real quick. Typo. Why? Attendance. Did I spell everything right? All right, let's try this again. What? Clear. Oh. Ruby. I'm losing my senses, you all. All right, got some attendance. So you immediately want to verify that you can get to attendance.all. Got some objects. So this is our relationship right now. We said there's some students who have attended some mods. This is the student. This is the class. I think I forgot to. Why are all of these mod objects? Student.all.sample. Whoa, what did I do? Let me try that again because I'm not sure why. Does anyone see why these are all mods?
You have to give them each a separate variable.
Maybe. I thought this sample would work. What's in student? Students mod. What? Why? Whoa, what did I do? Okay, well, this is why I should have checked before. Why is student a mod? Let's check out student, or let's check out attendance. Student, mod, student equals student, mod equals mod. Let's
Your
check out
students
student
has
data.
mod dot all rather than self.
Oh my God. Whoa, I'm sorry, you all. Well, that's a great lesson.
It's
Ruby
that
has
time of
implicit
day.
return. It is, I'm sorry.
Great watching debugging.
Oh, that's great. I totally forgot we added that there. This is why I should double check my code always. I was so confused. All right, so attendance for sure. Should be actual stuff. Great, perfect. Now let's actually, started that method inside of our mod, and I want to get to students. So this is where we can kind of start debugging some stuff. Students is an instance method. So let's say I want to find all the students in mod 1 right now. So I'm going to put a binding.pry here. We have some data to work with, so we can kind of just go from here. I'll restart this again. The amount of times that I've typed in console.rb. I understand why you wanted a faster way.
Yeah.
And let me type in 1.students. All right, so I'm in students. I'm in the scope of that instance. So self is going to be mod 1, which is perfect because 1 is who called it. And I want to be able to get students. And what we've defined is the only place that I can find any sort of relationship between a mod and a student is through the attendance objects that we've created. So this gives me an indication that I need to talk to the join. Typically, anytime you're trying to communicate between two objects and there's a join, you're only talking to the join class. Student doesn't talk to mod, mod doesn't talk to students. So I'm going to do the same thing. And this is that case where you're in an instance method, but you're talking to a class method from a different class, attendance.all, and this is going to return everything. And for now, what I want to do is I want to find the student object that is in mod 1. So there's a couple in here. I think there's 3 in here. So there's Ashley, Sandaria, and hey, this is like accurate, randomly accurate. Mod 1 students. When you're thinking about the steps for this, student is now nested inside of an attendance object. This is why it ends up being a 2-step process, because I need to find all of the attendance that has my current mod inside of it. And then I need to take it a step further to find the student objects from that. So typically the data that you want to get or the result that you want to get isn't always going to be directly at the perfect level. So that's when you have to do some chains or you have to do a couple method calls from there. So let's start writing this out. And if there's any questions, feel free to ask. So I'm going to talk to attendance.all. And any ideas? Let's do the first part. So if I want to take a look at this list and I just want to select the ones that have this object, what's a good enumerable to use?
Select.
Select. I think I said it. Yeah, select. Cool. I was like, wait, too late. All right. And then you can use select because we're looking for a specific data set. And in between the pipes, you want to list the object itself, which is still attendance. So I'm looking at attendance object. And what select is going to do is it's going to go through every single object. Enumerables always go through every single one, with the exception of find, where technically it stops after the first one. But it's going to go through every single one, and select takes in a conditional. So in this case, what goes in between the block is some kind of expression that's going to evaluate to true or false. And we want it to evaluate to true if it's Ruby, and we want to evaluate false if it's not Ruby. And the only variable that we can use to check that is self down here. Let me like clear this out. So self is the Ruby mod 1 object. So I'm gonna use self to validate, is this equal to Ruby or is this not equal to Ruby? So I'm gonna say, is self equal to, is this attendance object equal to Ruby? And if it's not equal to Ruby, so we're gonna say attendance. And if we look at the attendance object, when we're talking about readers and writers and getters and setters, our attendance object has an adder accessor for student and mod. So there's already a method there that returns this instance. So I can use it to say, grab the, in this case, self is mod. So I can say, grab the mod object from this specific attendance instance and check if it's equal. So let me finish writing that. So I'm going to say attendance.mod. So I'm going to rerun this again with my pry inside of the loop so you can see what it looks like. Whoa. All right. And I'm going to clear this out and call one.students. So I'm still in my pry, but this time I'm right here inside of the loop. So we can actually see what attendance is. So attendance is this first one. And just like we said here where we do attendance.mod, since this is an object, I can say attendance.mod and grab this instance right here. And if we check out self, notice how the object IDs are the same. Because when we created a new attendance somewhere in here, in our sample, it picked the random mod 1 object. And I need to somehow check if this evaluates to true or false, which is where the equals comes in. So I can say .mod equals self. So for our purpose right now, what goes in between the block is attendance.mod equals self. All right. Any questions on that?
So if you want to access, if you're for some reason comparing the name or the name in this case, you would just do attendance.mod.name.
Yep.
And the
Perfect
mod
question.
is the adder accessor.
Yeah, what you want to think about, let me like draw this real quick, is when you're looking at instance methods or when you're looking at objects, the methods and variables that's associated with that object travels with it. So right now we have, let me draw this like, so right now we have like this whole thing, which is self. Say. Let me clear this out. Clear. So right, let's say this is self, which is my.
I'll be able to hear as well. I mean, it might be, but.
Real quick. So this, where is self? This is self, which is a mod instance. So let me put mod. And we're saying mod dot, what did we do? Oh no, I wanted to say attendance. So let's say we're inside of our mod instance. So we have all of the mod methods. And we said attendance inside of that mod. So there's inside of that class, we're looking at our attendance object. So inside of this class, we start out in mod, and then we say, let's look at the attendance instance. And attendance has its own set of instance methods, which is its readers and writers. And attendance.mod has its own set of readers and writers. So you can see how even though we're just making method calls, when we're accessing that whole object, so when we're accessing the whole object, we also have the methods and variables associated with it, which is why we can say, in this case, we can say attendance.mod.description. Because that mod, that specific mod belongs to whatever attendance is keeping track of. That makes sense. So our attendance has like a mod, and it has a student, and it has a mod, the student, and it has its own set of readers and writers. So that's where that chaining and method call comes in, because you need to pay attention to which instance you're currently looking at and which readers and writers you have access to, because it's going to change depending on what scope you're in. If you're at this outer mod level, you don't have access to this mod, the students, readers, and writers. You have to go through attendance, which is why we need to loop through attendance first to get access to maybe all of the reader or all of the description, all of the names that belong to this mod, the student objects. So that's where you need to pay attention to how many layers deep do I need to go to get this data.
That method was looking for all the students that attended a certain mod instance.
Yep, exactly. So right now, even if you think about this, let's take this binding.pry out. Let me exit out of this. Clear. I have to wait a couple seconds because there's a delay now. So even looking at what this method is going to return, when I say one.students, I'm getting an array that has all of the mod1 objects, but we're still at this level here. We're not getting just the student objects. So to get from here to here, that's when you need to first say, oh, this is still an array. So I just need to go, so use some kind of enumerable to get this object. And I think we did this a little while ago. Oh yeah, for this, similar to this, I was looking at a bunch of objects. I wanted a specific attribute of that object. I'm looking at an attendance, and I want the specific student attribute, which is coming from this reader here.
Right. So there you would probably map all the students out of there.
Yep, I can say one.students.map, and I'll do shorthand. Ooh, sorry, I almost made the mistake. So I'm saying one.students, which returns an attendance. So in between the pipe, it needs to be attendance. And I'm going to say attendance dot student. So this time in between the block, it's attendance dot student because I want to pull out the student attribute. And this gives me, now I have what I want. I actually have an array of students that attend my mod because of my horrible sampling. There's two Sundarias now. So that's when I can say, wait, probably want to make a unique list. Oops, unique. That's why Ruby's great. It's like, did you mean? Yes. All right, so
a better name for the first method, because it says a helper, would you call that like attendance or something? Attendances?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Just so it's like a local, yeah, okay.
Yep, so if you can technically do this all in one, but if you're being dry, then you'll say attendances, and you can move this here.
Can you do it in one and not like split it?
I would say you can, it'll still work. It's not as dry. So
no, can
if
you just to type it so I can see the difference?
Oh, like add this in here too?
Yeah.
Yeah. And let me copy this over. So I'm copying it over, but you probably already, oh, let me clear this out. Clear. But you probably already noticed that we're not in console anymore, we're in the student now. So this scope needs to be whatever's in here. So that's where chaining can get a little weird, because one.students is actually the whole return value of this. So something you can do in Ruby is just say like .map. I don't always recommend it because it's hard to debug if it fails at some point. And that's where you can start to introduce variables, and you can say, these are attendances, and maybe say attendances.map. So if you're doing this in one method, this is most likely what your process is going to look like. Let me like say attendances method or something. Oh, sorry. I'll leave it. This is called the same as this, which can be a little weird, but you'll say attendances method here. All right. So this is if you're writing all of it in here. If you want to use the helper method, you already have a helper method that's finding all of the attendances for this specific mod. So you can say attendance method dot map and do all of this here. So both ways would work.
But there's no way to avoid having to loop twice through that. You can't like just automatically jump down one other loop.
You cannot. There is a enumerable called select with map or select and map, I think. So there might be another enumerable out there. You can write a reduce and have like a method inside of here that reduces it and automatically finds all of the students. There's like each with object where you can create a new object and return that. So there's ways you can hack it, but ideally it's always going to be that two-step process. You need to get to attendance first and then find the student. Cool. All right. Any other questions? Let me go back to the README. I feel like we went through, we got some practice with how to debug with Pry, and how to test your own code, which is mainly as we wrote some code out, we created some instances in console.all and put a binding.pry and just called those methods inside of there. So inside of each method, we just typed in the variables that we want and called the method to make sure that it works. So I would say like that's going to be typical flow without RSpec, how you're going to be testing your code. Put binding.pry where you need to, and anywhere you need to, as many as you want, and type in the method or call that method from the console to verify it works. So similar to how we did like one.students to see if we get the result that we want or the result that we expect. And joiner, is there an easier way to loop through them all? I would say like for this one, the most easiest way to access the add it all and loop through it is with the enumerables. And then you get to pick and choose which enumerables is gonna best fit that situation. And for chaining methods, anytime you wanna chain methods or I guess even method calls, whether it's an enumerable like we did here where we said .map at the end, or chaining methods like this, what you need to pay attention to is what is before the dot and what the return type of that is. We can only say .select here because attendance.all returns an array. We can only say .map here because we know that this whole enumerable returns an array. So typically chaining is going to entirely be reliant on what the return type of whatever comes before the dot is going to be.
Can you end .map? That's legal?
Yeah, it is legal. It will work.
So you would loop through the top part and then loop through, well, the order of operations work there?
So it'll go through this first because it's going to calculate all of the attendance and then it'll do the map on that. So this will happen first and then it'll map and then it'll do a .unique. So there's like a couple method calls happening, which is why it always gets a little weird. I usually recommend creating that array or creating that variable and calling the enumerable on that. So you can kind of separate your concerns a little bit. And typically, anytime you create a variable and you're doing a method call, it's a good indication that it could be a helper method rather than inside of that method itself. All right, and then let me go look at how to pull a particular set of data. I think this was of from the array. And this is going to be entirely reliant on what the goal is. So for our case, for example, in mod, we wanted to find all of the description. So we went through attendance.all.select and we picked out each attribute based on what we wanted. In this case, we wanted the mod. In this case, we want the student. So you have to really pay attention to what object you're looking at from that array and what methods you have available. Based on whether it's a class or an instance, there's different methods that are available to you. And then same thing goes for what's going to go in between the block. That is entirely reliant on what's between the pipes and what the current object is. Cool. I think we got a chance to go through all of these questions. Any final questions, thoughts? All right, I'm gonna stop recording. So let me clear, oh wait. Where's my bar? One sec, let me find my, oh, there it is. It likes to hide sometimes. All right, so I'm going to stop recording.